Thank you very much, Chuck, for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak here. What I would do just very briefly is to sketch out the follow-up initiative to the UN Decade of ESD, the Global Action Program on Education for Sustainable Development, and briefly provide a rationale for it. Many of you, but maybe not all of you, will be familiar with various aspects of the Global Action Program. But we thought before we go into the more specific presentations and contributions on the panel, it will be helpful to have a reminder of the framework that UNESCO provides to continue work on the UN Decade of Education for Sustainable Development, which, as you know, ended in 2014, in November, at the end of 2014, with the big World Conference on Education for Sustainable Development that Charles Hopkins just mentioned. The decade was concluded there, and ministers of education and non-governmental stakeholders together launched the Global Action Program on Education for Sustainable Development as a follow-up to the UN Decade. How did we as UNESCO, together with our member states and the non-governmental actors that we work with, how did we come to the point that we launched the GAP? We first reviewed the UN Decade and looked at the various success stories that were running during the UN Decade, the specific policy fields, for example, where there has been a lot of progress, and the good practices that have driven education for sustainable development throughout the 10 years of the UN Decade. And we also looked at the gaps and at the various things that remained to be done at the end of the UN Decade. We published a report on the decade, which we presented at Nagoya, and you can find on our website. And on the basis of this assessment of the UN Decade, we consulted with our member states and various non-governmental actors, also of course with our UN partners, and tried to identify specific areas of education and specific target groups where particular action would be most promising for the follow-up framework to the United Nations Decade on ESD. And I'll present these 5 priority areas in a moment. Here just a few background facts as a reminder to you. The Global Action Program was developed through a consultative process with our member states, governments, and with non-governmental actors, and at the end endorsed by all member states at UNESCO's General Conference, the UNESCO General Conference, a kind of analogy to the UN General Assembly, where later on, a year later, the Global Action Program was also acknowledged, and UNESCO was asked to continue the coordination the way we have done it during the UN Decade, also for the Global Action Program on ESD. I mentioned that the GAP was launched at the end of the World Conference on ESD in Japan, where we were also able to already present a number of concrete commitments by governments and by non-governmental actors to implementing the GAP. I think by the end of the conference we had collected around 360 concrete commitments to specific activities under the GAP, and some of those organizations that made a commitment and that continue to work with us for the GAP are here on the panel as well, and will also present their contribution to the Global Action Program. The overall goal is very simply to build on the successes and challenges of the United Nations Decade, to generate and scale up action in all levels and areas of education and learning, to accelerate progress towards sustainable development. And this overall goal has been broken down into 2 objectives, and that's particularly interesting, I think, in the context of the agenda of this conference here. One of the objectives looks towards the education stakeholders, towards the education community, and calls upon the education community to reorient education so that everyone would have the ability to acquire the relevant knowledge, skills, values and attitudes to contribute to sustainable development. So pretty much the agenda that we have pursued during the UN decade. And the second objective does not really look towards the education community, but to all other stakeholders that are concerned with sustainable development, and calls upon them to integrate education and learning more strongly as implementation strategies into their activities. That would be pretty much all the stakeholders that are represented through various workshops here. So, for example, climate, water, oceans, consumption, cities, etc. These are often very different people from the education community, and one of our objectives of the Global Action Program is also to create better synergies between the education community, the education stakeholders and experts, and those drivers of sustainable development that are not necessarily aware of the power of education to drive or to be a driver for sustainable development goals, as the conference title says. Let me show you the 5 priority action areas of the Global Action Program. As I said, developed on the basis of an analysis of what worked and what didn't work so well during the UN decade. The first one is to advance policy, or to create the right kind of policy environment for education for sustainable development. And that again both on the side of education policies to make sure sustainable development issues are integrated education policies, but also on the side of the whole field of policies that deals with specific sustainable development issues, climate maybe as the most prominent and most recent example, and make sure that education is integrated into those policy frameworks. The second one looks at the institutions, in particular education institutions, and tries to reform them, transform them in light of a whole institution approach that looks at learning content and methodology, but also at issues like campus management or governance of the institution, community outreach of the institution. All of that should be in line with sustainable development. There has been a particular workshop here on that topic specifically as well. The third priority looks at building the capacity of educators and trainers, because they are, I think maybe that's one of the most self-evident areas here. They are one of the key change agents when it comes to education for sustainable development. Another group of key change agents is the fourth priority action area, empowering and mobilizing youth through ESD and harnessing all the good education for sustainable development activities that are already underway and driven by young people. I'm glad we have a youth voice here as well on the panel this afternoon. The fifth priority action area looks at the local level and calls upon all the stakeholders that work at the local level, starting with local authorities, but then also private sector and NGOs working at the local level to create a learning environment for sustainable development in the community, in the city, or in the rural context. So these are the basically the target groups, and also the areas that we propose, or I need to say it even stronger, that our member states agreed upon as the follow-up priorities after the UN decade on ESD. And I think it would be very, very interesting on the panel and in subsequent discussions really to look at how can this matrix or this framework be used to drive the agenda of this conference. How can we use this matrix and how can we harness the contribution of all these actors and all these target groups to make sure that education is mobilized as a driver for each and every sustainable development goal. Before I come to the end, I'll just mention 4 implementation strategies that we as UNESCO propose and that we think can work well at the local, at the national, at the regional, and at the international level. We are using these 4 strategies at the international level to to drive the momentum for Global Action Program implementation. Of course, the international level is not the only one, as was the case during the decade. Most of the action really, by far, most of the action is happening at the local and at the national level. But at the international level, we're using these four strategies as well, building new momentum, building on the decade and continuing and renewing the momentum of the decade. We did this very specifically by calling upon stakeholders to commit to specific activities to the Global Action Program. Second strategy, harnessing partnerships, and we do this very specifically by working with a number of key partners at the global level that help us drive, help us keep education for sustainable development visible at the local level, but also drive the implementation on the ground. Fostering a global community or fostering a community of practice. We will organize a global forum that at the global level reviews progress on the gap. We'll do that next year in March. And we are just putting online, these days, in fact, an online clearinghouse on all kinds of good practices that are underway across the world on implementing the Global Action Program. And the fourth strategy is showcasing good practice that also works very, very well, of course, as you know, at the local, national, but also regional, international level. And at the international level, we are doing this very specifically by having launched a new prize with the support of the government of Japan, a UNESCO Japan prize for ESD that we awarded for the first time in November. With this, I come to the end, and I'm sure or I hope we have the time at the end of the presentations to discuss some of the issues, in particular the question, how can we use this framework to drive the agenda of this conference? Thank you very much.